Nancy was alone at work when she was attacked. Two men who were familiar to her viciously assaulted her while she was at work. There were two of them, and they came with weapons. The fragile, petite 20-year-old girl stood no chance. The men came for money, but that seemed insufficient to them. They ordered the girl to undress, tied her hands behind her back with her own bra, and mocked her for what seemed like an endlessly long hour. Eventually, they decided they couldn't leave a witness. They forced the girl to kneel and pointed the weapon at her. She cried, begged for mercy, if not for herself, then for her little daughter. But the killers were relentless. The sound of the gunshot interrupted her pleas. Gasping heavily, Janet opened her eyes and realized she was having a bad dream again, a nightmare that had happened in reality. On Monday, October 24, 1988, at 8:30 in the morning, the manager called the Pizza Hut restaurant in Austin, Texas, expecting Nancy DePriest, the assistant manager, to answer. She did not pick up. Knowing she likely had a lot to do that morning, he tried calling again a little later and then once more. Still, no one answered. An hour later, he decided to go to the restaurant himself. Nancy had switched shifts with a colleague that morning, and the manager was probably mentally chastising her for forgetting about this. However, upon arrival, he immediately noticed that the service entrance was open, although the door usually remained locked until the restaurant was open to customers. So, Nancy had indeed come to the restaurant and forgotten to lock up behind herself. In the dining area, the manager didn't notice anything unusual at first. That is, until he took a few steps further inside. Suddenly, he realized that the restaurant floor was flooded with water several centimeters deep. Perplexed, the manager called out for Nancy, but again, there was no answer. As he proceeded, he saw a dough mixing machine in operation. So Nancy had started working. But where was she? And why was the entire restaurant flooded? The manager realized that the water was flowing from the men's restroom. He opened the door and, to his horror, discovered Nancy. It became clear why she hadn't been answering. The naked body of the girl was lying under the sink. Her hands were tied with a bra. Her hair was in blood. Her eyes were open, but she seemed not to see anything, staring into space. The man hurried to call 911. Officers noticed that the girl was still alive and immediately took her to the hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery. She was in very bad condition, and no one expected a miracle. Nevertheless, the doctors were obligated to try. At that moment, the girl's relatives had no idea what was happening and continued with their activities, unaware that Nancy was hanging by a thread. Nancy DePriest was only 20 years old, but despite her young age, she was married and raising a young daughter. She had risen to the position of assistant manager at a fairly young age. The restaurant staff loved working under her leadership because they didn't feel like she was their boss, but rather a friend and mentor. She had a very kind, gentle, and nurturing personality that blended well with her responsibility and hard work ethic. Perhaps these qualities were shaped by her upbringing in Japan, where she lived until her teenage years. Nancy was a very active young woman. She participated in beauty contests, enjoyed fishing, skiing, and spending time with friends. She especially liked competing in softball tournaments held among employees of all 23 Pizza Hut restaurants in the district. It was because of a softball game that she swapped shifts on Monday, October 24, 1988, and asked a nanny to watch her daughter. In the morning, Nancy and her husband Todd left home with their daughter. They had a unique routine for leaving the house together. Nancy would get into the car with their daughter, while Todd would follow them on his motorcycle. Upon arriving at the restaurant's parking lot, Nancy would get out of the car, and Todd would then drive the car to drop off their daughter with the nanny. Todd would then return the car to the restaurant, switch to his motorcycle, and head to the Air Force Base where he worked as a mechanic. It sounds complicated, but the couple only had one car, and their child could only ride in the car. So on Monday, Nancy arrived at the restaurant around 7 a.m. About 40 minutes later, Todd knocked on the employee door, handed Nancy the keys, kissed her goodbye, and headed to the base, unaware that it would be the last time he saw his wife alive. The police began investigating the crime, which they treated as a murder. First and foremost, they determined the cause of the restaurant flooding. It turned out someone had stuffed a blue apron into the sink drain in the men's restroom and turned on the water. It was unlikely that Nancy decided to wash the apron herself. Therefore, the perpetrator seemingly wanted to dispose of evidence in this manner. Nearby on the floor were khaki pants, light blue underwear, and a blood-stained shirt, items belonging to the victim. The only thing missing was her bra, which the perpetrator used to tie the victim's hands behind her back. The bra was still on her when she was taken to the hospital. Additionally, for some reason, the killer did not remove the shell casing of the .22 caliber weapon. It was submerged in the water near where the girl lay. Since the girl was naked, detectives suspected sexual assault. There were no signs of forced entry at the door, leading police to consider whether Nancy let the attacker inside herself or if he had a key. In the restaurant dining area where patrons could play games while waiting for their pizza, they found a hair. The hair lacked a root, making DNA analysis impossible. Of course, they checked the cash register and safe to ensure it wasn't a robbery, as there had been a series of Pizza Hut robberies in Austin that year, with restaurants targeted 4 times. Approaching the floor safe, detectives indeed found it open and empty, missing $150. However, previous robberies occurred closer to the evening and never resulted in such terrible consequences. Could Nancy have recognized the robber, leading to her murder to eliminate her as a witness? Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors did everything possible to save the girl's life. Unfortunately, they realized they couldn't succeed. They kept her on life support only to allow her loved ones to say goodbye. Nancy's husband, Todd, was at the military base when he was informed that his wife was in a coma at the hospital. He couldn't believe it, as they had seen her just a few hours ago. How could she be in a coma? Todd dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. Calling Nancy's mother, Janet, through tears, he said, "Mom, something's wrong with Nancy." He explained what had happened: an attempted robbery where Nancy was shot. She was put into an induced coma, hooked up to life support, and without it, she wouldn't survive. It's hard to imagine the mother's state of mind, having to rush to the hospital, knowing she was going to say goodbye to her beloved daughter. As Nancy was an organ donor, her heart, liver, both kidneys, corneas, and bone marrow were harvested. After that, her body was handed over to the medical examiner for an autopsy. The results of Nancy's autopsy confirmed what the police had suspected. She was killed by a single gunshot to the back of her head, but she had also been sexually assaulted prior to that. A sample of semen was sent to the laboratory for DNA analysis. However, it's important to note that this occurred in the year 1988. The accuracy of DNA analysis at that time was far less advanced compared to what law enforcement agencies have access to today. Back then, scientists could only compare one DNA marker line. Therefore, even when a laboratory reported a match, the probability of error was much higher. Now the police were officially investigating Nancy DePriest's murder. Sergeant Hector Polanco was appointed as the lead investigator. Polanco was known for doing everything possible to close cases and obtain confessions. However, in this case, that was not necessarily a compliment. Polanco first spoke with the manager who discovered Nancy. The man had an alibi, which quickly ruled him out as a suspect, but he provided important information about the restaurant's operations and assistant managers like Nancy. They were issued a universal key that could access any Pizza Hut restaurant in Austin. This meant interviewing employees from all network establishments who might have had access to the key. Investigators had to assume that Nancy knew her killer. As a responsible employee, she wouldn't have let a stranger inside. Police also learned that at 8:30 in the morning, Nancy had called suppliers and ordered products for the restaurant. Therefore, the murder occurred between 8:30 and 10 a.m. when the manager found her. The news of the murder spread quickly, and residents were scared knowing a criminal was killing people right at their workplace. Polanco did everything possible to keep details of the case from the public, hoping to catch the perpetrator based on what he knew about the crime. He also asked all employees to report any suspicious behavior of guests or colleagues to the police. Meanwhile, the restaurant had reopened its doors to visitors, but there was now a security guard at the entrance because people feared another robbery. Then, 2 weeks after Nancy DePriest's murder, 2 visitors entered the Pizza Hut restaurant. The young people drove up to the restaurant but didn't immediately go inside. Instead, they stood in the parking lot and shone their headlights on the establishment for about 5 minutes. Then, finally, they entered and ordered a glass of beer. They clinked glasses, and the security guard overheard them drinking to Nancy DePriest. Further into the evening, one of the young men struck up a conversation with the security guard. He introduced himself as Richard and began asking questions about Nancy's murder, where she was found, how she was killed, and if a suspect had been caught yet. When the guard replied that this information wasn't disclosed, the young man speculated that there could have been 2 killers. This made the guard uneasy, and he asked the young man about his interest and where he had been at the time of the murder. The young man explained that he worked at another Pizza Hut restaurant in the network and was actually opening it at the time of the murder. Then, the young men left without finishing their beer. The guard pondered. If Richard was opening another restaurant, it meant he had a universal key. Combining this information with the strange behavior of the visitors, the guard decided to report them to the police. It wasn't difficult for detectives to establish that Richard Denzinger was 18 years old, worked at 2 restaurants in the city, and spent his free time with his manager, Donna Angstadt. His apartment neighbor, Chris Achova, also worked as a cook at another Pizza Hut restaurant. Chris was 22 years old and was the guy who came to the restaurant with Richard. Investigators couldn't ignore questioning the young men. Detectives found Richard at his girlfriend Donna's house and asked him to step outside. According to their report, when they mentioned they were investigating Nancy's murder, he pointed through the door at Donna and said, "There's my alibi." He explained that he was sleeping at Donna's house when Nancy was killed. But previously, he had told the security guard that he was opening another restaurant. An officer asked him to come to the station. They asked him what he knew about the case, and Richard claimed that according to rumors, Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol, and the perpetrator stuffed a blue apron into the sink in the women's restroom to flood the area and wash away evidence. Detectives were puzzled as to how he knew this. Even the new restaurant guard, who was closest to the investigation, didn't know all the details. Richard said he heard it from Donna's boss. When the police called him and asked what color the apron in the sink was, he didn't know the answer to that question. So how did Richard know? Of course, Richard denied being at the crime scene. He insisted he had an alibi, that on October 23rd, he and Chris Achoa bought beer and went to Donna's place. Donna was ironing in the kitchen while they drank beer and played cards. Around 11 o'clock, they invited Donna's friends to join them in a drinking game. Then Chris wanted to go home, but found that his car key was broken. They called another neighbor to pick up Chris. They left at 2 in the morning on October 24th, and Richard stayed overnight at Donna's. They were both very drunk at that point, and overslept for work. At 9:30, the manager called Donna to ask why they hadn't prepared the restaurant for opening. As soon as she hung up, Richard got dressed and ran to the restaurant by 10 a.m., so he had an alibi. Detectives couldn't understand how he knew about the evidence, but they had nothing on Richard, so they let him go. However, at the same time, they questioned his friend Chris Achova. Chris willingly agreed to talk with them. At the station, he was quickly led into an interrogation room where Sergeant Polanco entered. He immediately told Chris that on the streets, they called him El Diablo, which translates to the devil. In the interrogation room, such a statement could sound threatening, but we remember that Sergeant Polanco didn't mince words with suspects, so his approach was more direct. With Chris, Polanco didn't hold back and demanded that Chris tell him everything he knew about Nancy's murder. Chris, of course, said he didn't know anything. Then Polanco started pressuring him. He used various tactics, none of which could be described as ethical interrogation practices. The officer shouted, slammed his fist on the table, and threatened Chris with death if he didn't tell the truth. Considering that this took place in Texas, the threat was palpable. In contrast to Polanco, his partner, Officer Balaja, played the good cop, persuading Chris to tell the truth if he wanted to go home. When even this didn't work, Polanco began to convince Chris that Richard had confessed in the next room and was planning to pin the murder on Chris. Supposedly, the detectives understood that Chris came from a respectable working family and had never had reasons to deal with the police, and he should stop covering for Richard unless he wanted the same fate. Polanco showed him photos from the death scene and promised that he would never be able to hold his loved ones again. He also showed autopsy images of Nancy and demanded that Chris confess to everything and tell what he saw. At some point, a female officer entered the interrogation room who also spoke Spanish, like Chris, and he asked her if he could request a lawyer's assistance. She told him no. This was an outright lie, but Chris didn't know that at the time, and they continued to interrogate him in turns, the good cop and bad cop routine. The interrogation lasted more than 20 hours. Chris wasn't allowed to eat or drink. He was extremely tired, frightened, and exhausted, and his defense began to crumble. Chris confessed to being involved in the murder, but he claimed that Richard was behind it all. When he finally spoke these words, he sincerely believed they would let him go home. However, that wasn't the case. To start with, he had to provide blood, hair, and semen samples at the hospital. After that, the detectives took him to a hotel for the weekend. They told him that he had just implicated Richard and should not return to his apartment. When Monday came, they proceeded to the next stage of the interrogation, during which they uncovered the most gruesome details of the crime. After this, Chris signed his confession in the presence of witnesses. Following the interrogation, Detective Ballas called his brother and said he had just questioned the devil himself. Chris had lifeless eyes, and he had never sat next to such a cold-blooded person before. Chris Ochoa and Richard Denzinger were arrested on the 14th and 15th, respectively. Both were charged with murder, a crime punishable by death in Texas. However, there's a catch. In Texas, mere confessions are insufficient to convict someone of murder. There must be evidence linking the accused to the crime. Therefore, the police and prosecutors relied on the analysis of semen and hair found at the crime scene. Chris's DNA matched that of the rapist, and a pubic hair, believed by experts to possibly belong to Richard, was found. The hair lacked a root, and it was simply compared visually to Richard's hair under a powerful microscope, but it was still only a visual comparison. Before the trial, Chris told his lawyer that he was innocent, but his lawyer didn't believe him. The lawyer explained that the gruesome details in his confession and the partial DNA match indicated his guilt. He could only avoid execution by confessing and testifying against Richard. Therefore, just before the trial began, Chris admitted to firing the fatal shot. In other words, Richard would be tried on charges related to the violence. On May 5th, Chris pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence and testifying against Richard. Richard Denzinger's trial began on January 22, 1990. The young man did not admit guilt, and Nancy's family had to hear all the gruesome details of what they did to her. The prosecutor advised Nancy's mother, Janet, not to attend the trial. However, she felt she needed to know what happened to her daughter. So when Chris took the witness stand, she was in the courtroom and heard everything. It all started at Donna's place that evening. Donna was ironing in the kitchen when Richard told Chris they would rob the restaurant. Chris didn't want to do it, but he couldn't refuse. Richard had a whole plan to ensure they had an alibi. He devised that Chris would pretend to have broken his car keys so their friend would come pick them up, and they would all go home together. Richard would stay with Donna in the meantime, providing them both with an alibi. At 7 in the morning, they met at McDonald's. Richard showed up at the wheel with Donna. He brought the gun. They parked across from the Pizza Hut restaurant and saw Nancy arrive around 7:30 a.m. Using Donna's keys, the young men opened the door. Nancy was preparing dough. She noticed Chris and greeted him kindly. "Oh, hi, Chris," but Richard intervened. He threatened her with the gun, told her to shut up, and show them where the money was. The girl gave them the money from the safe. Then Richard said they needed to kill her, but first they would have some fun. The prosecutor asked if Nancy said anything, and Chris said, "Please stop, no need." She pleaded not to be killed, to spare her life. They silenced her, tied her hands with a bra, and dragged her into the restaurant hall where a pubic hair was found. Throwing the girl on a bench, they abused her. Then Richard ordered her to kneel, handed the gun to Chris, and told him to kill her. Chris held the gun in his left hand, placing his right hand on her shoulder. The girl cried, but Chris shot her, and she fell face down on the tile floor. Chris, horrified, said, "What have I done?" Then they dragged her into the women's restroom, where they again abused her in every possible way. In total, they did this about 10 times, with Chris only doing it to appease Richard. The wound on the girl's head was bleeding, but she didn't move, and they assumed she was already dead. Janet couldn't handle it and ran into the restroom because she felt physically unwell. Then Chris said they cleaned all the surfaces they could have touched. He helped Richard wash Nancy's body and opened the water in the restroom to wash away all the evidence. Chris gave the money to Richard, and they left in 2 cars. On November 9th, when they were relaxing at Donna's again, Richard said he had been to that restaurant on business and suggested Chris go there with him to have a drink. Chris, as usual, didn't want to, but Richard persuaded him again. Donna also testified in court against Richard. She recounted that on the evening of October 23rd, she had drunk a lot and fallen into a deep sleep. But in the morning, when she sat in her car, she noticed that the front seat was pushed back more than usual. In other words, someone had used her car, but the keys were hanging on the hook in their usual place at home. The day passed normally until news of Nancy's death broke. Then Richard immediately said to her, "I was with you, right?" But Donna wasn't sure. She was drunk and could have boasted about sleeping soundly. Initially, she didn't pay attention to these oddities, but later, they seemed suspicious to her. Testimony was also provided by a prison supervisor where Richard and Chris awaited trial. He recounted an incident where Chris helped distribute meals to inmates. As soon as Richard saw Chris, he erupted and shouted, "That's the rat who snitched on me." Richard then poured a drink on Chris and started a fight. According to the prosecution, these words served as additional evidence of Richard's guilt. Naturally, Richard's lawyer tried to argue that the prosecution had nothing but Chris's testimony and a single hair. Richard himself took the stand. He looked directly at Janet and claimed he didn't kill her daughter, that Chris and the police were lying, and that he spent the entire night and morning at Donna's. After 3 hours of deliberation on February 1st, 1990, the jury found Richard guilty of assault against the girl. It took them an additional 7 minutes to recommend a life sentence to the court. Undoubtedly, they believed Chris's gruesome confession and were convinced that the two deserved punishment. Nancy's relatives were satisfied that the justice system had worked effectively. But this is far from the end of this story. On the contrary, 6 years after the conviction of the two men, investigator Manny Fuentes was asked to examine very strange letters written by a prisoner from Texas. His name was Akeem Joseph Marino. The man was serving 3 life sentences for violent acts against women and armed robberies. But this was one of those rare cases where a person had truly changed for the better, had rehabilitated. In prison, he underwent a dependency treatment program and found faith in God. Now his religion demanded that he confess his sins to receive forgiveness for them. Therefore, for several years, the man had been sending letters to the District Attorney of Texas, to the police, and even to the office of George Bush, who was then the governor of Texas. The governor, in particular, received a handwritten letter on 4 pages. To draw attention to the letter, Akeem signed it Confession of Murder. He wrote that in 1988, while in Austin, he assaulted and robbed a 20-year-old girl at a Pizza Hut establishment. The victim's name was Nancy Lena DePriest. He was arrested on another charge literally a couple of days after Nancy's murder, and they confiscated the murder weapon, as well as other evidence capable of proving his guilt, but the police did not pursue these matters. Akeem sent so many letters detailing the crime that he forced the police to investigate them. First of all, he went to the prison to talk to Chris, where Chris categorically refused to speak with him. Texas police investigators were confident that Chris's confession was worth reading, and it became clear who the real killer was. But Manny Fuentes had to be convinced, and something was bothering him. The main issue was that 2 years after the trial of Richard and Chris, Sergeant Polanco was caught on video beating a suspect, attempting to extract a confession. Additionally, he lied on the witness stand, not in Richard and Chris's case, but in other cases. Incredibly, after being suspended, he was able to return to work. However, Fuentes realized that if Polanco lied once, he may have done so repeatedly in the past. Then the detective began to scrutinize the evidence in Nancy's case one by one, and there were numerous inconsistencies. First and foremost, discrepancies in timing stood out. According to Chris, they entered the restaurant practically right after Nancy at 7:30. But we remember that her husband brought Nancy her car keys, and then she placed a grocery order over the phone at 8:30. Furthermore, why did the forensic team find so few clues if the perpetrators were tormenting the victim for over an hour in various locations? Not to mention that the shell casing was discovered nowhere near where, according to Chris's testimony, they shot the girl. Manny Fuentes decided to find out what weapon was seized from Akeem during his arrest. Unexpectedly, it turned out that at the time of the arrest, in addition to the weapon, there was a universal key to Pizza Hut restaurants in his possession, as well as bank packets with the restaurant's name on them and an amount similar to what was stolen from the restaurant. It was entirely unclear why these items were considered his personal property when it was obvious they were related to another crime committed by the man. The police still believed there had to be some connection between Akeem and Richard and Chris. Perhaps there were actually 3 criminals involved, but nothing indicated their connection. Neither letters from prison, visitors, nor cellmates. Finally, Fuentes decided to talk to Akeem. Akeem was calm, confident, and told a very convincing story. On that fateful morning, he was scouting for a restaurant suitable for robbery. He targeted a place where there was only 1 car parked in the lot. He disguised himself as a maintenance worker and pretended to have come to fix something. This was why the restaurant staff let him inside. Initially, he stopped at another restaurant, and an employee allowed him to enter. But Akeem reconsidered robbing it because he hoped to find a woman in the restaurant. He left the establishment and tried his luck at another place, Pizza Hut, where Nancy worked. Of course, the girl let the assumed repairman in. He forced her to hand over the money, then led her to the men's restroom where he forced her to undress at gunpoint and tied her with a bra. He assaulted her in the restaurant hall, where the hair was found. Then he led her back to the men's restroom, promising to handcuff her to a pipe under the sink and leave. However, when the girl bent down to the pipe, Hakim shot her. The girl did not expect this. She did not beg for mercy. The man looked for the shell casing but did not find it and, afraid of losing too much time, fled. Detective Manny Fuentes tried again to talk to Chris, but Chris was afraid that another false confession would be extracted from him and he would be charged with another crime. Additionally, he knew that if he continued to insist on his innocence, he would not see early release because the commission would not believe in his remorse. Therefore, when the detective asked him if he was innocent, Chris replied, "No, I am guilty." Why didn't the investigators come to Richard? Unfortunately, it was already impossible to talk to him. Back in 1991, another inmate attacked the young man. He repeatedly struck him on the head with a boot with a metal toe. The attacker mistook him for someone else, but that no longer mattered. In an attempt to save his life, doctors removed part of Richard's brain. They did not expect him to survive, but he remained alive, if that can be called life, because he never fully recovered. Losing part of his brain meant losing part of himself, unable to care for himself independently. What's worse, he was returned to serve time with other inmates, where he was constantly subjected to abuse, beatings, and other forms of torture. By the year 2000, DNA analysis technologies had significantly advanced. Hakim's samples were compared with the evidence found at the crime scene. The hair and semen belonged to Hakim, as did the weapon. Therefore, there was no evidence linking Richard and Chris to the crime. But how did Chris know so many details about the case? In reality, we don't know what he knew. Detective Polanco tried several times to record Chris's confession on film, but Chris kept saying things that were not what the detective needed. Eventually, they forced him to sign a confession typed by investigators. They knew all the details of the case. The rest they invented. And Chris, worn out, exhausted, ready for anything, signed the confession in the presence of witnesses. In fact, Chris and Richard were just curious young guys who worked in the same restaurant chain as the murdered girl and wanted to know the details of the case, wanted to know if it was safe to continue working in the restaurant chain. But that was enough for a false accusation. Neither of them had problems with the police. Chris grew up respecting law enforcement, but the police intimidated him, didn't allow him to call a lawyer, convinced him they had evidence of Richard's guilt, and Chris gave in under their pressure. Detective Polanco finally retired. In this story, he is a true villain, but he never faced consequences for the harm he caused. It was too late, especially for Richard. The 18-year-old was deprived of freedom, health, and essentially, a normal life. Both men were released in January 2000 after 12 years of imprisonment. Richard received over $10 million in compensation. Chris received $5 million, but gave most of it to Richard. He felt guilty for not being able to protect himself and his friend. To this day, some people believe Chris should spend the rest of his days in prison. But it's easy to say when you haven't experienced days of interrogation without food, water, and under the pressure of El Diablo. Janet visited Hakim in prison to find out why he killed her daughter. He told her that since childhood he had heard voices in his head. And that day he decided that if he met a blonde woman, he would kill her because that appearance was associated in Hakim's mind with a prison guard he despised. He told Janet that her daughter didn't plead for mercy, didn't cry, and didn't know what awaited her. It all ended very quickly. Hearing this, Janet became furious. For years, she believed her daughter begged for her life for over an hour while two men repeatedly abused her. She had nightmares of her daughter suffering. But now she knew for certain that detectives in the police force had invented and exaggerated all the shocking details of this story. Even the jurors were ashamed to have been part of this process. Hakim was sentenced to another life term. He didn't plead guilty due to insanity. He wasn't sentenced to death because Janet opposed it. In fact, the woman became a staunch opponent of the death penalty and, along with Chris Achova, who became a lawyer, advocated for police interrogations to be recorded on film. Janet died in 2019 at the age of 69 from lung cancer. Richard also passed away in 2021 at the age of 50, losing his battle with cancer. But why were Hakim's letters so fiercely ignored? Firstly, because prisoners have a lot of free time in prison, many of them start writing similar letters. Secondly, the Bush office claimed they ignored it only because the man wrote that he had already contacted the district attorney's office. But why didn't the district attorney's office do anything? Of course, no one wants to admit that in such a high-profile case, they unfairly convicted two innocent boys and forced them to give testimonies invented by detectives.